Advocacy Program's fourth 2020 ECHO presentation. NMFAP is a model of respondent parent representation being implemented in the 13th and 2nd judicial districts that utilizes interdisciplinary teams of lawyers, social workers, and parent mentors working effectively together to provide quality representation and advocacy and support families need for reunification or other preferred outcomes in the child welfare system. As participants in our community of practice, you will receive professional development from experts and early adopters of the NMFAP model, learn best practices, and collaborate to solve issues that present challenges to providing quality parent representation in the court system. So I'd like to start with introducing everybody. My name is Caitlin DeFiore. I'm one of the lead social workers for the program, and I'm going to be facilitating today's ECHO session. Jen, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Jennifer Vieira with the AOC. I'll be offering technical support for any of you today. Just a reminder to press *6 if you want to mute and unmute and you're joining from your phone.
And then if I could have the other leads introduce themselves.
I'm Quiva Hubbard, Parent Mentor Coordinator of New Mexico Family Advocacy Program.
I'm Leslie. Hey guys, this is Andrea Gunderson, one of the lead attorneys.
Catherine Brock, I'm one of the lead social workers.
Hi, Camille Hancock, one of the other lead social workers.
Leslie, did you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Leslie Johnson, one of the lead attorneys for the program. Thanks.
So that we're able to know who else is here with us today, if you could please enter your name and email in the chat. That way we can see who was able to participate with us. If you could please remember to complete our post-session feedback form. At the end of the session, we would really appreciate it. Funding for NMFAP ECHO is provided through a federal grant, and this helps with our evaluation process. Jen will put the link to the evaluation form in the chat box. Practitioners, in the future, please sign up to present a case or issue problem solving for our May 5th session. Our session, okay, so today's presentation is going to be done by Amy Whitfield. Amy is a special projects coordinator for the New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department. In her role, she is responsible for planning and implementing projects that move forward the strategic plan goals of the CYFD administration. Current projects include developing a new workforce development division, which will build the professional development of new and existing employees and build pipeline programs to child welfare employment. Ms. Whitfield has had a strong career in social services. She received her master's degree in social work from the University of Maine and has worked in small nonprofits servicing numerous fields, including anti-violence, substance abuse treatment, teen pregnancy and parenting, leadership mentoring, community organizing, and nonprofit program development. She is the former executive of the YWCA New Mexico and the NM Domestic Violence Resource Center. Ms. Whitfield also serves as an educator facilitating anti-racism training, mediation and development plans for nonprofits, leadership and boards, and as an adjunct faculty in social work for the Central New Mexico Community College and New Mexico State University. So the learning objectives for today's presentation are, one, reframe our understanding of the importance of cultural competency to necessity for cultural humility, to recognize the connection between cultural humility and safety for motivating and engaging clients, and 3, demonstrate ways to include cultural humility in your child welfare practice. And I'm gonna turn it over to Amy now.
Thank you so much, I appreciate it. I just wanna thank all of you all for joining today and for giving me the opportunity to speak with your group today. I get really excited about talking about cultural humility in all different kinds of ways, but really to be able to talk about it around child welfare is extremely important. So let me make sure that I can get my full screen going here. Oh, let me just use this one up here, slideshow. We'll No. There we go. So I'm really excited to talk to you all today about cultural humility in child welfare practice. My plan is for us to go through the slides that I have and for me to be a little preachy for a second, probably not a second, for probably 30 minutes or 45 minutes, to be real preachy about cultural humility and child welfare practice, and then for us to open it up to questions. So I believe that probably most of you have already taken some sort of cultural competence or cultural humility training before. So I'm not going to get into the very specifics of what cultural competency is or cultural humility is. I really want to talk more about the framework of why we include it in our work. And so first, sorry. I told you, my dog, I put the picture up of my dog so you see that she's really, really sweet, so that when she starts barking, you won't be as upset at her. You'll be like, oh no, it's a really cute dog. So it sounds like she's gonna be okay for a little bit. So let's just start by looking at the objectives today. That I really want to reframe the understanding of the importance of cultural competency, right? Because for many, many years, we've really looked at cultural competency rather than looking at cultural humility. And so that we've talked about how important cultural competency is in engaging with clients. And what I want to share today is that we need to reframe that to think that cultural humility is a necessity for us to actually get our work done. The other thing that I want to cover today is really recognize the connection between cultural humility and what that means for safety and how we motivate and engage our clients. And then also I want to demonstrate some ways to include cultural humility into your own child welfare practice. So I see that everyone really knows how to use the chat. You guys have all put your names in there. You've put your emails in there. That's wonderful. I invite you to, while I'm doing this presentation, for you to also put questions or thoughts up into the chat to share with everyone. I'll try and look at the chat as well as present at the same time so I can bring some of those comments into what we're talking about. It'll make it really great if you're commenting the whole time so that we can bring in your thoughts into what I'm saying as well. So I want to first start talking about cultural competence versus cultural humility, right? And so there is this debate in social work and a debate in social services about what is more important, right? What should we be looking at? Should we be looking at cultural competence or should we be looking at cultural humility? And some people have even said, well, it's not really about, one or the other. It's about combining the two. But I'm really going to say, from my point of view, that cultural humility is the most important, and it is what is actually the best way for us to build ourselves up so that we can engage with clients in a much more meaningful and motivational way. And so what exactly is the difference between cultural competence and cultural humility? Before I move on to this slide, I just want to check in with Caitlin, Leslie, all of y'all. Is the sound okay? Am I speaking loud enough? Okay, great, thank you. Don't want you guys to just be hearing silence. So that when we talk about cultural competence, what we've really said in the past is that, in order to be a good child welfare worker, in order to really be in this system, that you have to understand that not everyone is the same, right? That we're all different. And so what we've said in the past is, you got to go out there and you've got to learn about the other groups, right? You have to learn how they like to interact. You have to learn what's important to them as far as family goes. You have to learn what's important to them as far as values are and all of that. And that we've spent a lot of time making sure that people are getting CEUs around cultural competence, right? So that means I want you to go and take a class on the LGBTQ community and learn what's important to them and learn how they interact with each other and how they interact with services. Or we want you to go and learn about the Hispanic culture. And it's this idea that I can spend some time, in social work, it's required 6 hours of cultural CEUs, right? So that I can spend 6 hours every other year being taught about someone else's culture, and then I can learn it. I might even be able to train it myself, and somehow I've achieved competence in working with that culture. And I think that that is a really detrimental view of how marginalized communities are, right? Because I know that if I have met one Black woman, that I know that one Black woman's story. I know her experience, right? And that doesn't even mean that she and I are going to have the exact same story, that we're going to have the exact same culture, that we're going to have the same values and the interactions, right? Because we know that cultures and communities are not monoliths, right? And so it doesn't mean if I have a client who is from the LGBTQ community, that because I've taken one class, I now know how to interact with that person. And it really gets into this idea of stereotyping people, stereotyping groups. And I think it's much more detrimental. And then what it also does is it says that what I can do is achieve this, right? That it only takes a certain number of courses for me to achieve the process of being culturally competent. And so that it's not something that I have to work on over and over and over again. It's something that I just I've finished. And that, I also think that is very detrimental to our communities. And so I think it's actually a necessity that we reframe this idea of cultural competence into really focusing on what is cultural humility, and really thinking about that as we approach the child welfare work that we do. And cultural humility is different because instead of saying, hey, I want to go out and learn about someone else's culture, what it says is it's an ongoing process, right? And that ongoing process isn't necessarily about learning someone else's culture. It's much more about me self-reflecting and doing a personal critique, right? It's about making sure that I know what my biases are. It's about making sure that I understand what are the things that make me hindering when I'm working with marginalized communities. What are the things that stop me from being someone who's coming in to be the savior, and versus someone who's coming in to really work together and be part of that community and to engage and motivate in a way that is not intrusive or oppressive. And that what it also says is that if I take a practice, a cultural humility practice, that I cannot forget that there are social justice issues that exist for the communities, the marginalized communities that we work with, right? And so that it isn't just one person who's standing in front of me, it is a history of social justice issues, and it is the social justice issues that we currently have existing in our nation. And that cannot be separated from the work that I'm doing, and it cannot be separated from how I interact with people from marginalized communities. And so when we talk about cultural humility, right, naturally, the way that we interact, it's the way that our society has brought us up, right? We're a very individualized society. We have been taught that our natural focus is on us, that we are the center of all of it, right? That when I walk into a room and I see something going on, that I connect that with my reality. I connect that with my experiences. And that's who I am, right? I determine what is right, what is wrong. I determine what is good, what is bad. I determine what is respect and what is disrespect, what is professional and what is not professional, right? And that I really get to look at access and barriers from my own framework, right? I get to identify what is of value, and I identify what is of worth from my own perception, from my own lens. And that's a very natural thing for our brains to do, right? It doesn't make us bad people because we do that. What it does is it says, you know, we've been taught that that's how it goes. But that if you want to really have a practice of cultural humility, what has to happen is you have to change from this framework where you're the center and every interaction you have is from your own lens, and you change it into one where you are just part of the spokes, right? You're just one of the wheels. And so that what we do is we really focus on your own values are something that are kept level with all of the other things that you need to be thinking about. And so you want to also be thinking about other people's values. And it's a huge shift to make. It's a huge shift to say, in when I'm looking at this situation, how do I view it from my own values? Because that's natural. But how do I also see how someone else's values might view that same situation differently? And how do I create in that situation space for learning, space for inclusion, self-determination, right? And how do I reorganize and change so that my reaction is not from my lens, but that my reaction is from those other things, right? And how do I interact in that moment so that I'm recognizing what my biases might be and actually changing my biases if I can, right? And I want to be really clear when I say changing my biases if I can, is because it is not an easy thing to do. When we say, oh, you know, there's a bias, I recognize my bias, I don't have it anymore. That's not realistic, right? And far too often people say, oh, I recognize my bias, or I recognize my privilege, and now I don't have it anymore. And that's just not realistic, right? And so that it is an ongoing process. You have to be engaged in that process all the time to really make sure that you are changing your biases, right? And thinking that it may be multiple experiences that get you to that. So that one of the things we have to really do, and this I think is a very simplified way of saying cultural humility, is forget the golden rule, right? Far too often we use the golden rule, which says, do unto others as you would have, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? That's the golden rule. And that many of us live our lives that way, and that we really feel like that is us being kind and generous and inclusive people, right? Is that we're saying, if I would treat myself this way, I want to treat other people that way as well. But that what we really need to do if we're having a cultural humility practice is that we want to do unto others as they would have you do unto them, right? That they get to make the choice about how they're treated. They get to make the choice about how they're included. They get to make the choice about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. And they get to identify what is worthy of values, right? And that this is really a very hard thing for many of us to do, because it's absolutely switching our own values into making space and priority for other people's values. And so that becomes really the very simplified way of doing cultural humility. But it's a simplified way of saying it. It's a very hard way of doing it. Because what that means is that you have to be self-reflective all the time. It means that as you engage in any experience, that you have to step back and say, what's happening in this moment that's teaching me about myself? What's happening in this moment that is making it so that I can understand where someone else is coming from versus understanding this experience from my own lens? So I want to focus a little bit on what that means for child welfare, right? So how do we implement a practice of cultural humility into child welfare? And one of the things is that we have to remember that the clients we're working with are going through a cycle of change, right? And so that we have to understand where they're at in their cycle of change. Are they at pre-contemplation? Are they at contemplation? Are they in maintenance? Are they in relapse, right? Are they learning from the relapse that is going on right now? And so this becomes really interesting for us in how we motivate and engage with folks, because it actually, when we're talking about these cycles of change, is that our interaction becomes a little bit different when we're talking about a cultural humble practice, right? So that if we're looking at pre-contemplation, I hear people say all the time, right? Like, oh, I use motivational interviewing. And so very often what we're talking about when we say I use motivational interviewing as my practice is that we're not really using it as a motivational tool. We're using it as a manipulation tool, right? And so that what we're saying is, I'm going to use motivational interviewing to manipulate this person into seeing my point of view of where they need to go, right? Where they should be at in this cycle of change. Rather than saying, I'm going to use motivational interviewing as a tool for me to understand what are the reasons why they may or may not want to move from contemplation to preparation. What are the things that they're seeing that could be of value for why they're in action or why they want to stop taking action, right? And so I'm using motivational interviewing here as an example, but that we do this with multiple different tools that we all have in our social work toolbox or our legal toolbox or whatever profession you're coming from, right? Is that instead of using the tools to get people to where we want them to go, we need to start opening up the door to see how those tools really allow them to explain what their values are, where they're coming from, what they care about, what they're interested in, and really connect that to what we're feeling and understand that we might be coming from a different place, right? And that a lot of times that really has a social justice factor, and that it also is about motivation and engagement. And so we really want to say change requires motivation and engagement, but that it comes with client safety, right? That if I'm a client and I'm interacting with you as a lawyer, as a social worker, as a caseworker, as a GAL, right, wherever you're coming in, is that you really need to think about how are you creating client safety, right? And in the chat box, we have a question that says, how do we balance the self-critique and self-hatred? And sometimes they get tangled in the self-reflection, right? And so one of the things that I always talk about is the first thing that we have to think about is what is productive about our self-critique, right? Guilt and shame are very rarely productive. And that when we talk about that, I mean, if you've done mindfulness, if you've done motivation, if you've done mediation, if you've done any of those things, getting stuck in that idea of guilt and shame, that's really not productive at all, right? And so self-critique that ends up in thinking about guilt or shame means that you're not being productive in this process for client safety, right? And a really great comment that just came through says, treat ourselves gently as we would a child who is learning new things, right? And that's really important because again, if you are getting stuck in this if you're getting stuck in this self-hatred, or you're getting stuck in guilt, or you're getting stuck in shame, that you're not actually moving forward, right? And that we want you to be learning new things. We want you to be invested in change. We want you to be invested in learning about yourself, not because it's about making sure you're a better person, but we want you to be able to learn about yourself and change so that you can engage in giving your clients safety. Another comment that comes through, one of my mottos is, it's not about me. That's a really great response, right? That it isn't about you, right? What we're having you do is we're having you self-critique, again, not because we want you to be a better person. We think you were probably a great person to begin with, right? But that we want you to engage in self-critique so that you can create safety for clients, right? Thank you guys for commenting on that. Keep those comments coming. Uh-oh, moving too fast. Lindsay says, that's going to be my next tattoo. That's a great one, right? I'm sure that's what you want to see on yourself when you're 80 years old. It's not about me. Where did we go? Okay. So when we think about client safety, right, the first thing that we really want to look at is you cannot identify yourself as safe, right? Far too often we've gone through this process where it's like, I took an anti-racism course, I learned about my privilege, you know, I got my degree in feminist studies, and now I know that I'm someone who understands this, and I now have been credentialed to go out there and work with people, and I know that I'm safe, right? But the reality is that you might not actually be safe to someone else. just who you are as a person might not be safe for them. And so you don't get to identify yourself as safe. You have to wait for them, the community that you're working with or the person that you're working with, to really identify you as safe, right? And you might want to ask those questions. You might want to make sure that you put yourself into a space where you can say, you know, what might be safe for you in interacting with me? How might I create a safe learning environment? How can I create a safe environment for you to answer these things truthfully, these questions that I'm asking you truthfully, right? And so don't assume that you're safe because you have been through the process of self-critique, you know? The other thing is, don't assume that you're safe because one person has told you, one person from a marginalized community has told you that you're safe, right? Far too often what we do is we get that one person in our life from the marginalized community to say, oh yeah, you're fine, you're cool. And now all of a sudden think we've been branded the ability to be safe to all people from that marginalized community. Or we say, you know, do it from everywhere. One of the things that I hear all the time is, well, I can't be racist, I'm married to a Hispanic man, or I have Hispanic children. Or, you know, I'm a man who's a feminist. I bought the t-shirt. I went to the march. My wife tells me that I'm the greatest man in the world and that I'm like the one man that she knows who's always been sensitive. That's your wife's explanation of you. Don't expect that all women feel that about you in the room, right? And so we start to do this thing where we tokenize someone to be like, okay, speak for me, brand me as safe, and then I'm going to take that to everywhere else. And we've got to really make sure that we don't do that, right? Because again, the difference between cultural competence and cultural humility is that we know we cannot stereotype one whole group and let one person speak for that whole group, right? We have to constantly be self-critiquing and self-reflecting to make sure that we are interacting with each person as an individual. They are a member of that group and we should recognize that, but it does not mean that we can stereotype them to the beliefs that they should have about us, right? So moral of that story is, know that you are not always safe. No matter what you have gone through, no matter what you have learned, you still want to make space for the person you're interacting with in that moment to say, I'm not feeling safe right now. How can we change this relationship? The other thing that we really want to think about with client safety is recognizing the social issues of race and ethnicity. I just put race and ethnicity up there, but I want to make sure that we're including multiple marginalized communities in this discussion, right? And so it's about recognizing the social issues of gender. It's about recognizing the social issues of the LGBTQ community, right? That it's really important that we don't forget that those social issues are there, right? They're living them every single day. And so that it isn't just, okay, you know, I'm interacting with you one-on-one. It is, what are the social issues that bring you here, right? That when we're talking about child welfare, we know nationally, right? This isn't even just a New Mexico issue, that nationally there is a huge disparity of the type of children, the children from marginalized groups that come into our care. That is a social issue that we have to be cognizant of. And that we have to recognize power and privilege, right? What is our power just by being who we are in this room? What is our privilege of being who we are? And how do we work to make sure we're not going to just erase that, right? But how do we make sure that we're being aware of it in the moment? And so another question is coming through the chat. How do we help our clients be able to challenge us or confront us if they don't feel safe? That is an excellent question, Susan. Really love that question. And the reason I love that question is because, again, it goes back to how much we have to know about ourselves, how much we have to critique ourselves and be aware of our own biases, right? Because the first thing that you have to do is start to think, okay, what might be, what you're going to say, this is what would feel safe for me, right? And you're going to create a room like that. You know, if you're a client, or if you have clients who come into your office, what you might do is you might say, okay, I'm going to decorate my office this way. I'm going to put pictures of my family up here so people understand that I have family. I'm going to, you know, put a picture, like a motivational poster over here that says, give everyone a chance, right? And then all of a sudden my office is this beautiful, safe environment. And then now everyone's going to come in and they're going to sit down and they're going to just go, oh, I just love this office. You've given me a soft chair. You've given me great lighting. You've got the like Michael Jordan motivational calendar. Therefore, I'm safe, right? I know all of your offices look exactly like that, you know? And so what it is that that's not necessarily safe for people, right? And so what you have to do is you have to ask people, you know, you have to start that conversation. You have to reflect on, you know, here's the things that I think are safe, and I've created this space for you, but let me open it up and say, what might actually be more safe for you, right? If I offer you water, do you feel like I'm making a great gesture, or are you worried I'm poisoning you, right? And, you know, we don't have to be that extreme in our conversations, but open it up. Let them hear that, you know, there might be something that they're feeling really anxious about, that they're feeling some anxiety about, that they may be feeling like you're out to get them, that kind of thing. And that you really start to work with them in that way to say, hey, you can challenge me. But the other thing that you have to worry about is exactly what Kristen just said, right? Recognizing that a client challenging us is good, you know? Because far too often we open the space and we say, tell me, how can I be more safe? How can I be this? And then they say it to you and it hits your trigger, right? And you're like, hold on. No, I didn't mean for you to say that, right? It's this like, tell me how I can be better. Oh, but I didn't want you to tell me that thing. I'm not really willing to work on that, right? So then again, you're just unsafe. And so you have to recognize that them challenging you is good. You have to recognize that they're going to challenge that one thing that you don't want them to challenge. And you're going to have to recognize that it's time for you to make some changes, self-reflect, self-critique, and actually change the bias if you can change the bias. The other thing that we really want to do when we're talking about client safety is, for ourselves, we really need to connect history to the current fears and the current coping skills and the current barriers of the people that we work with, right? Far too often we take the time to learn what has happened historically and we say that was horrible. I cannot believe how our country did that in the past. And we forget that our country still continues to do those things today, right? And I do not have time today to really go through all of the atrocities of our history and to connect those to our current fears and coping skills. But I just want to give you an example of something that I've seen in the time that I've been at CYFD, right? So I'm sure most of you know what this picture is, right? It is a picture of Native American children in a boarding school. And when I show that picture, most of you will know the historic atrocities of that, right? We know the story of children being forced to leave their families. We know the story of children being deprived of their language, deprived of connection to their family, deprived of their spirituality and religion. We know those stories. And that we often watch documentaries, or we watch movies, or we listen to speakers, and we hear that and we are immediately just shamed and feel like, how could that happen? That was so horrible. We never ever want that to happen in our country ever again, right? I think most of us would agree to that. But this is a comment that I actually hear very often at CYFD, right? People saying all the time, the child is doing really, really great with those foster parents. They have such opportunities. Now they're with those foster parents. They're at a great school, and now's the time that they're able to succeed, right? And that no one is saying that statement without, with malice. No one is saying that statement because they're like, we should go back to the times of boarding schools. No one is saying it like that, right? But we have to realize the connection between that statement and the same statements that people made when they forced Native American children into boarding schools, right? That those two things are not that far apart. And that what we have to really be able to challenge ourselves in this self-critique is, what comments am I making? What thoughts do I have? What actions am I doing that might be really, really similar to the historic atrocities that I've seen in the past or that I've heard of in the past, right? And again, it's not about saying I'm a really bad person for thinking this. It's about that process of self-reflecting. It's about critiquing yourself. It's about, when I think about success as going to a good school, how is that different from the people in the past? What is the bias that I'm having that is really connecting to those historic things? And how far past their behavior have I really gone? So when we talk about this, right, the key to cultural humility practice is a practice of critically self-reflection, right? So that we want to always be looking at everything we do with a critically self-reflective lens. And this is not easy. It is hard. It takes time. It takes opening up yourself to criticism, opening up yourself to being challenged, all of those things. And so what I like to do is, anytime I'm feeling that little bit of discomfort, I want to first say to myself, have I just missed an opportunity to learn about myself, right? In those moments of discomfort, it's time to sit in that and really think about, what is this moment when I'm not getting along with someone, I'm not connecting to someone, I'm not judging their success the way they would judge their success? How can I learn about myself, what my biases are? What are the things that I value that someone else might not value? And then the second question I ask myself is, have I just missed an opportunity to connect with someone else, right? Have I missed an opportunity to be safe? Have I missed an opportunity to motivate? Have I missed an opportunity to engage? I really want to make sure that I'm able to assess that moment in a way to say, okay, how do I take my values out of the center and put it on a spoke at equal footing with this other person's values or this other community's values? And that really becomes just the starting place for us to really be able to engage in some critically self-reflective practice. And those are the two questions that I like to use. I think you can form any two questions that you'd like to use for your own critically self-reflective practice. What it is forming a question that in any moment you can feel uncomfortable, that you can sit back and really think about those questions and think about how that gives you more information on your biases and how you might change those biases. So that's my moment of being real preachy. I hope I can open it up for us to have some questions and some comments, any thoughts that you might have. I think you can unmute yourself, or you can put it into the group chat, any questions or comments or just general concerns that you have that we can all talk about as a group to finish out today.
Hi, Amy. This is Susan. Thank you. This is fantastic. I really loved hearing all of it, and it's all true. And I have found myself in positions in my life and my career and personally where I know that I just stepped all over it. You know, like I know that I just really can't. I come from a different. I come from the north. I come from north. You know, state farm, white farmland is where I grew up. So when I came here to New Mexico, I made lots of references that were outdated and geographically weird from being in Wisconsin and coming here. And I had to learn how to live with being able to say, I am so sorry. This came from some unconscious place of my 6-year-old self that I just said that. And it's horrible. It's really humiliating. It's an internal shaming. You hope that you're not going to be too shamed externally, but if you're confessing it and admitting it and being able to live with it inside, nobody externally is going to shame you. It's internal stuff. And so I just wanted to share that. This, the words are powerful, but I'll tell you, it is so hard to do it. You have to be able to live with that flush of, I'm awful, Done.
Thanks so much, Susan, for sharing that. And I think the thing that I connect most with what you're saying is that it's your 6-year-old self, right? And that we have to remember that so much of us have been taught this stuff. We've been taught this stuff from our own parents. We've been taught this stuff from our teachers. We've been taught this stuff from media. And it wasn't like anyone took us to the side and sat us down and said, hey, read this book on how to be a racist. I want you to act like this for the rest of your life, right? That's not how it happens. What it does is that, the way that we interact with our parents, the way that we interact with our teachers and our friends and all of that has really set up our values, and it's set up what's supposed to be, I remember the very first time I took a feminist class, right? And it was race and feminism, or race and gender in education. That was my first feminist class that I took. And of course, right, very first chapter that we were reading talked about how teachers call on boys way more than girls. And I was like, I'm sitting here, I'm a college student, I know that I'm smart, I know that I'm capable, yet I also know that every single time a boy starts talking, I shrink back, right? I think, oh, he's gonna definitely answer that better than I am. And that is not about who I am, that's about what I saw my teachers do when I was 6 and 7 and 8 and all of that. And so that's the grace that we have to give ourselves, is that this is the thing that we were taught, and now it's time for us to unlearn it, right? And so that a huge part of cultural humility is unlearning the things that we have learned from childhood and beyond, right? So there's a question from Cynthia Shavers that says, what about when people say we should not see color, right? We call that colorblind racism, right? And it is one of the most detrimental racisms that exist, because what colorblind racism says is that you have to assimilate to the dominant culture, right? In order to be something that we accept, in order to be a success, in order to be to be part of us. And so, Cynthia, we could do a whole 6 hours of cultural CEUs just on colorblind racism and why it's so damaging to our community. But really, the thing that I would say, right, with a limited amount of time, what I would say is, when you say to me that you don't see color, what you're saying is that you ignore my identity, right? Because who I am not a white woman, I am a Black woman, right? And so that if you're not going to see color, you're not seeing who I am. It doesn't stop you from being racist. It's actually more racist. It ignores me, right? Another question, how do you know when you've made major strides in improving your capacity to critically self-reflect? I think, that's going to be different for each and every one of us. In my opinion, I think that you've made some major strides when someone gives you critique and you say, that's a gift, right? That's like my bar for success. I know that I'm never going to stop making mistakes. I know that I'm never going to stop, putting my foot in it, all of that. But if I can actually, when someone gives me that connection, if someone says, hey, what you said really offended me, if I can say, you know what, thank you for that gift, that gives me something to think about for me to change, then I think I've actually made some strides towards being a better person with a more culturally humility practice, right?
Could I jump on that? I don't want to take your time.
No, please.
So I think over time, what I have had to learn to do is I'm outside, so I might hear an airplane going over, but you can only hear what you're saying through your own eyes and ears and your brain, and what you hear is what you've always heard, so it doesn't jar you. But what I've had to learn to say is, if I was this person listening to that person, if I was that person listening to me, what would I hear when I just said whatever it is that I just said? And it helps me think, oh, well, I don't think that would sit well. I mean, you got to extend your borders of experience into other people's, at least hearing. You can't live their life, but hearing even the words can seem so stupid when you get outside yourself to hear how are you connecting the English language in this way, kind of thing. So
Yes, that's great. Any other questions or comments, things that folks want to say? I see a comment from Kristen. It says, if you can't see colors, then you are missing the rainbows. Oh, that's an awesome. There you go. That's a tattoo for you, Lindsay, right? Right next to it's not about me. Any other questions or comments? Can you talk about how an advocate can take what you've taught today and present that to the court? Decision makers need to be aware of their own biases when making critical decisions for families. Yep. Well, first, I think, right, we always want, I really kind of believed that all of you had probably already gone through an initial cultural humility or initial cultural competence class, and probably that you were interested in that class and paid attention to it, right? And so from my point of view, that's why I start with what I'm talking about. But I think if you're talking about someone who is really not aware of their own biases at all, that you have to start with really the very specific information around what is cultural humility, why is it important, what are the disparities in our system, right? And I think I learned something from Stephen Brooks, who is one of our juvenile justice staff here at CYFD. And what he said to me once, that, even after years and years and years of doing race education, all of a sudden turned a light on for me, is that he said, in juvenile justice, if you do not take the effort to make sure that the young Black man is not being treated differently, we know the young Black man will end up in our systems. They will end up in our corrections. And so that he said, when you do nothing, you almost absolutely guarantee that it is going to be the young Black man who ends up in our juvenile justice facilities. And so I think for me, that was just such an eye-opener around how do I help people understand that doing nothing is the same as creating racist structures, right? Or creating homophobic structures, or creating classist structures, or whatever marginalized community you're concerned about, right? And so that I think the way, if I was an advocate talking to the court, I think that's the way that I would go about it, right? Is really making sure that they understand when they do not focus on stopping the disparity, they actually allow it to continue. But I want to open it up and see if someone else in the room has maybe some other advice that might be really good, right? Kristen Conley says, we can add that to new judge orientations, right? Do not assume that attorneys or judges got any cultural humility exposure, right? It's not in the curriculum. It's not in any of our curriculum, right? Esteli Juarez says, it's not enough to not be racist, you have to be anti-racist. Absolutely, right? There is a spectrum. Just because you are not the person out there shooting unarmed people doesn't mean that you are the solution either, right? Leslie says, we also often run into poverty bias in our work, right? That is a really, thank you, Leslie, for bringing that up, right? That is one of the things when we're talking about class oppression, how often people come into our care, children come into CYFD care simply because of class issues, right, of poverty issues. And that has to be part of the conversation when we're talking about cultural humility as well, right? Very good. Clarissa says, another motto, when fighting denial, bring an army. The more people who say it, the more likely it is that it will finally land. Thank you, Clarissa. I think that's great, right? We all have to be, and we are all part of that army, right? We all need to be the people who are willing to speak up and say this. But I do want to say that, you know, in anti-racism work, in anti-sexism work, that very often we have hit a point where we just don't understand why people haven't changed, you know? In the Women's March, I think 2 or 3 years ago, there was this poster, and it was this like 98-year-old woman, or I'm saying 98 because she looked really old to me, but I don't know how old she actually was. And her poster was like, I can't believe I'm still having to march against this, right? And it's just the greatest poster I've ever seen. I loved how it went like on viral on Facebook. And I think for many of us, we feel like we have been fighting this fight for so long that when we're talking to someone who hasn't quite made the leap to self-critique that we want them to, sometimes we can be really punishing in our language. And I think it's important for us to, yes, each of us speak up, but again, you know, like many of you have already said, let's speak up with kindness, let's speak up with gentleness, right? Let's really welcome people into our movement of cultural humility rather than really taking the stance of like, I have got to scream at you until you understand my pain. Invite people to understand your pain, right? But let's invite them in a way that doesn't actually throw all of your pain on them, right? Let's be kind and gentle as we bring people into the movement, right? By the movement, I mean the anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic social change movement, right? Does anybody else want to say anything to the questions that I've read out loud from the chat? I feel like I answered them, but so many of you have expertise that you might want to give some of that here today as well. Questions or comments from the...
I was actually writing something in the chat because I think the challenge may be however passionate we are about being anti-racist, and we may have a multicolored family ourselves, we're still having to advise people who have the deck stacked against them in the system, and they have to get CYFD on their side and the court on their side. And so any way of helping us to translate our belief in them or our support for them in that context would be helpful.
Absolutely agreed, right? And that is the trick of first becoming safe. I think one of the things is that when you're not safe and you just give a ton of positive feedback, it just feels condescending, it feels inauthentic, it feels a lot of different things to people. And so that one of the ways that you can really make sure that you're engaging people in being advocates for themselves is first making sure that you're really connecting to that safety. And I think the earlier question that was, you know, how do you empower clients to challenge you if you're unsafe? If you can really master that, that becomes this huge thing to empower them to be able to speak to people of authority all the time, right? To really self-advocate for themselves in authority and to win people to their side. So, I mean, again, that's just ways that I would do it, but I think there are other people who might do it in other different ways, right? Another question, what kind of impact can we make with people that believe they're non-racist but don't agree or acknowledge that there is internal work to do? You know, I'm going to go back to Clarissa's motto of when fighting denial, bring an army. I learned a long time ago that the way that our brains work around racist and sexist and homophobic views is that you know, you don't change your mind, right? Like that's not how the world or the brain works. You don't change your mind. What happens is the people around you start saying this is unacceptable, right? And so that when all the people around you say your behavior, your conversation, the beliefs that you have are unacceptable, then all of a sudden you start to say they're right, right? But that you're not going to just change your mind automatically. And it's why colleges and universities and going away to school is such an amazing way of change in our world, because so often young people leave their families and they go into a new environment where the environment says what you're saying is not acceptable. And so, you know, again, I think Clarissa has a really great motto there, right? Fighting denial, bring an army. So I think we're at the end of our time. I'm going to ask Caitlin, do you have anything you want to close on? Do we have any last statements that we want to look at, think about?
I would just like to thank everyone for attending today's session and ask that you complete the feedback survey. Jen will post the link again for those of you who may have missed it before. And let everybody know that our next ECHO didactic session will be on June 16th, and the topic will be the connection between sex trafficking and child welfare. And we want to thank you so much, Amy, for presenting. We really appreciate you being here with us today and taking time out to do it.
Thanks for your time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you very much.